So now we're going to move on to creating a gradient backdrop and playing with the shadow. So I'm going to create another new layer, and I'm going to grab the gradient tool, and I want it to go from black to white. So black is my foreground color and white is my background. I'm going to grab my gradient tool here, and up in the options bar, I want to click the very first option where it does go from black to white. So now, if we hold the shift key and we drag down, we can create a gradient. A shorter gradient is harsher, or a shorter line creates a harsher gradient, and a longer line is a more subtle gradient. So I'm liking how that's looking, and the reason I held the shift key was so that it would hold a straight line or a diagonal, and you can see it's kind of jumping like so. I'll do Command Z because I like that last one better, but just so that you know that you can do that. Okay, so now I've got the gradient. Next up, let's create a shadow. So I'm going to utilize this layer mask that I have already created, and I'm going to hold the Command key and I'm going to click on the layer mask in the Layers panel. And by doing that, it brings up the dancing ants, a selection. So let's create a new layer. And for this selection, we want to fill it with black. So now that I have the selection made and I have a new layer, we'll just turn off that top selection and we'll fill that layer with black. I can hit Command D to get rid of the dancing ants. I'll turn that layer back on and I will go to my Move tool. To do that, I'll just hit V on my keyboard and I'm just going to push down a couple of pixels. So now, if we look, what we're doing is we're going to create the shadow that sits on the ground here. But notice we have shadow here because we pushed the whole thing down. So we'll add a layer mask to that layer. This little icon here, the third one over. We'll grab our paintbrush and we'll paint in black where we want to get rid of any of that selection we don't want, like so. And that is our contact shadow. Next up, we're going to create another blank layer, and we're going to make that selection again. Well, let's do this first. Let's pick our foreground color. This time our shadow is not going to be black. It's going to pick up the tones from within the image itself. So I'm going to make this a little bigger. I'm going to come down here to an actual shadow spot and just click. And I don't want it to be pure black. I'm going to look for something that has a little bit of warmth to it. Something about there. And we'll hit OK. This time, let me shrink that back down again. We're going to do the same thing again, which is we're going to Command click on the layer mask, bring up those dancing ants. We're going to turn off that top layer for a second. Looking pretty, isn't that? And what we're going to do is we are going to grab the gradient tool again. This time we're going to not go from the dark brown that we just picked to white, but we want to go from the dark brown to transparent. And remember, the checkerboard indicates transparency. So I will just drag up from the bottom of this selection and paint in that black. Notice if we turn that off, the layer below, it looks a little bit better. Okay, turn that back on, hit Command D to get rid of our dancing ants, and this time we're going to come over here to Transform, Distort, and we are just going to pull this out like so. We'll tighten that up. We don't want this, I'll use my little arrow keys there a little bit to move it around. We don't want the shadow in the bottom corner here to be popping out past what we're looking at. And I'll make this a little narrower here. And kind of something like that. Keep finessing it a little bit. Bring that up. A little bit of fun in there. Okay. And I'm going to hit the return key. Now, I didn't do a very good job there, so I'm just going to add the layer mask once again, and we're just going to paint on the bottom here. B for our brush, get rid of that off the bottom, and a little bit over there too. Now, what we want to do is click back on the pixel part of the layer, and we're going to blur this because shadows are blurred. So we're going to come up here, and we're going to go Filter, Blur, and then to Gaussian Blur. And that's looking pretty good. I'm about 13. You can see if I go back down in the radius, it's got a harder edge and then a softer edge, but I think that was looking pretty good and about there. So I'm going to hit OK. Now, a lot of times shadows get a little bit blurrier out towards the edge than they are at the base. So I'm just going to use my brush again to kind of go and have some fun, make my brush nice and big. I've got a soft edge brush again. My opacity is going to be, let's see, 40%. And I'm just going to kind of click back on the layer mask. I just did a Command Z. And I'm just going to kind of soften it up a little bit up top here. And if you feel like that's a little too much, you can go Command Z, step back, play with it a little bit. But let's see what that looks like. If I hold the Control key and click on my layer mask, I can disable the layer mask. So that's what it was looking like before I kind of softened it. Once again, hold the Control key and click on the layer mask and enable the layer mask. So that's how we can see the layer mask on and off. I'm liking how that's looking. It's looking a little bit better. And I'm just going to pull the opacity down a little bit more. That's looking pretty good. Now, one of the things I saw that I'm liking was I'm just going to add another new layer, and I'm going to do another gradient. This time I'm going to do the radial gradient. I'm just going to, make it about so. Up and go to my move tool, and I can move it around. But here's the fun part. I can go Command T, and I can just kind of shrink it in a little bit, put it at a slight angle like what we got going there, pull it down. Hit the return key. Now that doesn't look real great, but I'm just going to really lower the opacity down here. And I think that that little bit of extra spill just looks pretty nice. It's kind of softening up that background. So I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. The next thing I want to do is to unify this. So I'm going to create a dodge and burn noise layer. So to do that, I'm going to hold the Option key and click on the new layer icon. In here, I'm going to go Mode, take it down to Soft Light, fill with Soft Light Neutral Color 50% Gray, and hit OK. Now I have this layer that's doing nothing. Remember, it's a dodge and burn layer, so if we were to paint with black, it would burn, paint with white, it would dodge. But what we're going to do is go up to Filter, go down to Noise, add Noise, and in here, we want to choose Gaussian, and we want to choose monochromatic. If we don't have monochromatic on, you can see that it's little chunks of color, not real nice, so the black looks better. Obviously, I cranked up the amount so you could see it, but we do not want that much. So the amount that you choose is going to really be dependent upon how big your image is. So be sure to look at the image at about 100%. I'm at 200% right now. There I am, 100%. And dial in just a little bit of grain. And it just helps to unify the image. Okay, so I think I need a little bit more than that. That's too much. Let's just try 3. 3 is looking pretty good. I'm using my keyboard commands. 4. Actually, I think I like 3 on this, so I'm going to hit OK. And now, double click on the hand tool so I can see the whole image. That is the gradient with the shadow in the background. Well, I'm almost done. Looking at it, I want to add a little bit more tone to the base of the image. So I'm going to come back over here to the layers. I'm going to create another new layer. And I'm going to do that gradient that we did a minute ago, the radial gradient. And I'm just going to draw it out like so. I'm going to do a Command T. And I'm going to shrink it down, kind of make it kind of big like so. Hit the return key. Now, obviously, it's a little too much, so I'm just going to pull the opacity down. And I'm just kind of liking how it's kind of helps if I hit the right button. It's just kind of giving us a little bit more of a grounding, so it's not so pure. So I'll pull that down a little bit more. And you know what? Now I think we're finally done with this one. So give it a try.